you began to plant the seed in people's minds. But I think in the process, you did create a media image of me that's far beyond, the reality of me.
And this craving, this awful, raging, eating feeling inside. I could feel it consuming my insides. It was overwhelming me.
Hello again, and welcome to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Elissa Kerrill, and I am the host, writer, editor, all the things. Over here, we talk about all manner of true crime at this point, but we also get the whole picture to fully explore the nature versus nurture aspect of people who commit these horrible crimes. If you enjoy learning the kind of what and why, then you've come to the right place. Subscribe, like, share, follow. Everything is in the notes below. So this week's podcast will be on the Giggling Granny, otherwise known as serial killer Nannie Doss. Now, this story has some twists and turns, and even I raised an eyebrow a couple of times. So, Nannie Doss was born Nancy Hazel in November 4th, 1905, in Blue Mountain, Alabama, kind of central eastern part of the state. And since we haven't in a good chunk of time, let's go back to 1905 and see what was going on in the world when Nancy was born, to see if perhaps stress or any kind of exposure affected her mother's pregnancy. And we look at all of the things over here. So, history for that time, right? Well, the Russo-Japanese War had been going on, and this year, the Russian general surrendered Port Arthur, which was actually located on mainland China, back to Japan, who then controlled that until China got it back in 1945. Also, a number 6 moon of Jupiter was discovered this year via the Lick Observatory at the University of California. Norway had a tsunami. 3 separate 135-foot waves crashed in, killing 61 people. And that's a big deal in Norway. This is also the year known for Bloody Sunday, sometimes known as Red Sunday. So it happened at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Russia. A group of peaceful protesters led by a priest were just absolutely gunned down by the Imperial Guard. Riots were also beginning to break out in Warsaw, Poland, because it was under Russian imperial rule. There was also an uprising in 6 cities in Argentina against the government under President Manuel Quintana. A French ship wrecked off the coast of the uninhabited Auckland Island, located 290 miles or 470 kilometers south from the nearest inhabited land in New Zealand. The castaways had to live and survive on the island for more than 3 months before being rescued, which is just crazy. The Chancellor of Justice of the Grand Duchy of Finland, whose name I wouldn't tarnish trying to pronounce, was assassinated at Helsinki. And then just 11 days later, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, the Governor General of Moscow and uncle of Tsar Nicholas II, was assassinated. And for those that might not be sort of geography people, that sounds like actual something, right? Because Finland and Russia are neighbors. Finland person was assassinated, a Russian was assassinated, lots of back and forth there back in that day. Now, Albert Einstein was busy doing his thing, right? There was a horrible earthquake in India that killed over 20,000 people. Las Vegas, Nevada was founded when 110 acres of land adjacent to the Union Pacific Railroad tracks were auctioned to form what is now downtown Los Angeles. The goddamn Ottoman Empire was still around. If you're one of my OG listeners, you'll remember the goddamn Ottoman Empire. Hundreds of people died in flooding in Mexico. So there was a lot going on in the world the year that Nannie was born, but this gives us some perspective on the world that she came into. So for the purposes of the story, we will call her Nannie because I read that that had been a nickname for her since childhood. Her birth name is Nancy. We'll call her Nannie. So Nanny was born to parents Jim Hazel and Louisa, or Lou, Holder Hazel. She had 3 sisters and 1 brother, so she was one of 5 children. The brother, the only boy, was the baby. Her father, James Franklin Hazel, or Jim for short, was himself born in 1875 in Alabama. His grandfather, so Nanny's great-grandfather, had settled in Alabama from South Carolina. Louisa was born in 1878 in Alabama, as did her father before her, but her grandfather had also hailed from South Carolina, so Nanny's great-grandfather on her mother's side. So we see a long history in the eastern, kind of southern eastern part of the U.S., these established families that stay in the same general region for multiple generations. Jim and Lou, as she was called, got married in May of 1898, and again, Nanny was the firstborn. Now, would you like some tea on Jim and Miss Lou? Well, from the book Black Widow, The True Story of Giggling Granny by Ryan Green, it was said that Jim had inherited a farm from his parents when he was still pretty young, and his parents had some debts out there that were attached to this land. By the time that was all taken care of, he only had a few acres of dirt and a few outbuildings that were in dire need of upkeep and repair. And he didn't have any money. Quote, no bank or seed loan outfit would front him the cash required to get the farm back in action. He had enough savings and dairy cattle to subsist for a few years, but without a lump sum of money to get things moving, his situation was never going to improve. End quote, out of that book. So Lou, before she met Jim, was rumored to be pregnant already after having visited a military base nearby, and she was getting far enough along that she couldn't hide it anymore. Lou's parents could only do so much to help her. I mean, being pregnant out of wedlock was a huge deal back then. She gave birth, but had met Jim, and they were married shortly after, so if this book is true, that would mean Nanny was in fact not Jim's biological daughter, and as far as I read, there was no telling who the real father was. But Jim didn't care at all that the baby wasn't his. It was said that he didn't really have a lot of marital options himself because he was kind of poor, and so the two married. It was convenient. It helped them both. There was no honeymoon period because Jim immediately put Lou to work to get that farm up and working as fast as possible. And he wasn't always very nice about it either. In fact, he barked orders at her and prodded her with a cane that he used to prod his own cattle. And he made them work from before the sun was up until it was long past dark. So right out of the gate, all sources spoke about how her having a difficult childhood was a very real thing and that she was deeply unhappy. It was said that Nanny didn't get much attention due to all of the work that had to be done around the farm, so the only way she could get it was to scream. And as soon as she could walk, her parents, but mostly Jim, had her working, whatever she could do to help in her very limited capacity. And if she couldn't accomplish as much as Jim thought that she could in that moment, well, she'd get the same treatment as her mother. Needless to say, Nanny hated her father as each child came into the world, but of course Lou would not be permitted to be pregnant during harvest, right, apparently. And Nanny was tasked with taking care of her younger siblings as each one was born. She learned to cook and clean and mend clothing and all of those things at a very young age. And she did all for her younger siblings, okay? As she aged, she really wasn't allowed to go to school because, again, the farm needed so much attention. And as hard as the family worked on that farm, the most they could ever do was just barely break even. And then after harvest and it got cold, there was less to do. Only then was she and whatever sibling was old enough was allowed to go to school. They walked 2 miles in winter weather one way to get to the schoolhouse. So needless to say, Nanny was working with nothing more than an elementary education. But one thing Nanny had begun to learn in school that she adamantly continued practicing at home when she couldn't go was reading. She absolutely loved to read and gobbled up books quickly. Sources said that books were an escape for her. I mean, same. The rigorous hard labor along with tending small children left her little time for any kind of fun. Books gave her a different sense of freedom, and I think a lot of us bookish people can full on understand that. Unfortunately, Nanny was also bullied in school because the whole county knew that her family was exceedingly poor. And I didn't find anywhere where she had any close friends during her childhood either. No real social life other than visiting family was allowed by her father. And it was during one such trip, visiting family kind of down in the South, this is when we see our first sort of clue into the mind of the giggling granny, our first accident. Okay, so when Nanny was 7 years old, the family all piled onto a train to make the journey, and it had been raining, so everything was wet. It was still early spring. This is to set the scene. Now, Dad was irritated that the younger children were a bit restless, but Mom had gotten some old magazines out. She distributed them to the kids, and they settled in for the trip. Lou was actually very supportive of Nanny's love of books and saved up spare change to buy her old, used, tattered books, as that's all they really could afford, but her daughter was always really happy to get them. And Nanny was sitting in her spot on the train, happily reading along, when the train made a very sudden stop. There was a tree overturned across the railroad tracks, and this resulted in the conductor having to slam on the brakes, right? This resulted in Nanny being lurched forward quickly, and she hit her head on a metal bar on the back of the seat in front of her. Everyone else only suffered bumps and bruises. But Nanny remained unconscious for the rest of the train ride and only briefly woke up and opened her eyes through the absolute stabbing headache and recognized that she was on her uncle's couch. But she was in and out of consciousness for hours after. From that moment on, Nanny would experience sudden and shockingly brutal headaches, had them for the rest of her life actually. The concussion she experienced also caused some permanent damage. And since she was sitting forward and head perhaps tilted down just a bit, reading peacefully of course, it would be safe to say that she hit that oh so critical prefrontal cortex area. So what does that look like? Well, the frontal lobe is responsible for decision making and self-control. Impulse control, guys. Impulse control. It also helps us to regulate emotions. This is the part of the brain that manages your interactions with other people. This is very oversimplified. But the frontal lobe regulates your behavior and helps you to know what is socially acceptable and what is not. According to Very Well Health, there are many symptoms that suggest frontal lobe damage is the issue. But the ones that apply to us for this story include inability to solve problems or perform tasks, impaired judgment, difficulty in controlling emotions, depression, changes in behavior, low motivation, poor attention span, impulsivity, and risky behavior, and so on. Now, we in the true crime community fully understand that when looking into some dangerous, murderous person's background, and we hear, head trauma, it's an automatic sigh. It's like, oh, okay, yep, there it is. Or at least a large piece of the puzzle, okay? So for years after she had these horrid headaches, she would experience blackouts, and she experienced very real crippling depression. And this was her existence into her mid-teens. Worked like a dog on the farm, helped tend to the young'uns, though it was said that her mother was loving to the children. She cooked, she cleaned, she went to school when she could. Now she was dealing with these violent headaches and blackouts. She would be perfectly happy and content for a while, and then get into these bouts of rage. But I read that mostly she just cried a lot. Now, her father would not allow Lou to take Nanny to the hospital or to even be seen by a doctor. He said they didn't have the money for it, and he needed her working on the farm. Recent head injury, back working like a dog. And she could no longer keep up the pace that he expected of her, and so his punishments were becoming more harsh. Now, sources said she came to loathe her father, and like true guttural hate. She felt that her father didn't care if she were alive or dead. And that is another big scar, that is another big puzzle piece. The man that had been her father, who had always been harsh and just kind of a dick, began treating her much worse after her head injury, even though she wasn't faking any of her symptoms. That's a father wound to a daughter right there. And come on, dude, daddy issues are just a whole world phenomenon at this point, right? So Nanny went from being a passionate reader to a nearly obsessive reader, just living out the stories and the fantasies of her mind. She was going through puberty, and the romance novels her mother got her really seemed to plug into some part of her psyche. She fell in love with the idea of love. She over-romanticized everything, but in the privacy of her own head, the fantasy world became all-consuming. She daydreamed about the perfect man that would show up and sweep her off her feet, the white knight in shining armor, to come save her from the evil ogre in her house. And as Nanny became old enough to begin dating in her mid-teens, it was said that Jim didn't allow his daughters to dress up fancy, no makeup, no doing your hair nice. They weren't to be calling attention to themselves like that. There were no school dances, no county fairs to go to, and meeting people, new people and boys, that wasn't going to happen. Jim apparently was convinced that if he let his daughters go out looking attractive, they would get molested. I mean, I guess his heart was in the right place. 1 point for Dad, maybe? No? But as much as Jim feared men on the outside of his circle, he should have been paying attention to his inner circle. Because the family continued to go visit relatives as their really only true socialization. And there were uncles and cousins that would indeed sexually molest the girls. And then when Dad would find out, why, he would beat that relative bloody. Except for the one that touched Nanny, right? Because apparently Papa Jim, he didn't really actively seek out to destroy anyone who put their hands on Nanny. And in fact, she would get into trouble for the offending uncle or cousin. Nanny was horrified that her father seemed to be more accepting of the violations against her, and her loathing of her father took on a new intensity. He had been her acting father her whole life, and now it felt like he didn't care for her at all. And we all know what happens to girls whose fathers fail them. There's like a whole porn genre about that very issue, right? And so this is when we see another shift in Nanny's personality, or just a shift really in her mindset. While she still loved reading her romance novels, she began reading her father's newspapers, specifically to peruse the Lonely Hearts section, or the missed connections, if you know what I mean. This is, of course, old school, before dating websites and whatnot. And then she began writing some of the men in the advertisements, but she never really got any letters in return, and so she just assumed that her dad was taking them, though he didn't whack her with that cane for it either. And so she decided she had to get out of there. She was nearing 16 years old, and she was now as strong, if not more so, than her mother, and her father was pushing her to begin really taking on more full weight of the physical labor around the farm. She begged him to let her go out and get a job away from home because the pay would be more steady, it would be more money, and thus help them with the bills for the farm. And shockingly, he actually agreed. She left the next morning to go find a job. And so Nanny went to work at the linen thread company in nearby Anniston, and she actually rather quickly made friends and was described easily as a social butterfly. Men noticed her, and she didn't mind the attention necessarily, though she did not sleep with any of them. She was described as quite pretty, and it was while she worked at the factory and made these new friends and having this new wonderful life that she met Charles, or Charlie, Braggs after she had turned 16 years old. He was handsome and had fallen for her nearly immediately. She took Charlie home to meet her parents, and both Lou and Jim found him to be a fine young man. Charlie had a sickly mother who he was taking care of, and he was, or at least seemed, responsible with money, himself only being 17 years old. 4 months later, Nanny and Charlie got married, and try to remember, she met the guy and was married to him 4 months later. Now, the source material alluded to the fact that Nanny might have felt forced into the marriage because her father had wanted her to marry Charlie, and Charlie had kind of gone through her father to get the proposal. as if she didn't really have time to really think about it, or that the decision was really hers to begin with. So something to think about. But, they got along okay. Charlie was no knight in shining armor, of course, and she began to see that marriage was not like a romance novel. And on top of that, her mother-in-law now lived with them. And her mother-in-law was a douche. That's really all you need to know. She was one of those manipulative mother-in-laws. Her son was her puppet. But during this marriage, Nanny and Charlie had 4 daughters. But by 1927, the now 22-year-old Nanny knew the marriage was over. She had started smoking when she worked at the factory for the socialization that it does produce for smokers who go outside for a smoke. But the stress made her chain smoke really bad. And she had also taken up drinking, and the stress she felt she was always under due to her mother-in-law's constant nagging and being the shadow over her shoulder and knowing Charlie wasn't being faithful. Of course, neither was she, but still. And the depression that had always come and gone after her head injury began to come on stronger and truly linger. The thought of doing anything that required the slightest movement of muscle was unbearable, and I know I've certainly been there. But she had an advantage against her mother-in-law. She had given Charlie 4 children, so Nanny stopped trying to appease her as well. But with her depression, the drinking, being a woman about town, so to speak, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to want to take care of 4 children, and so one morning, Nanny told their eldest daughter, Melvina, to just eat her toast with the butter and leave the porridge to the 2 middle girls, and of course Melvina did as she was told. The youngest was still a baby at this point, I believe, still on milk. The 2 middle girls were very sick by lunchtime, with the local doctor having to be called to come quick to see what was wrong with them. And they died, guys. 2 innocent children whose cause of death was listed as food poisoning, but innocently. Even Charlie's mother didn't have anything negative to say about Nanny in this regard, and Charlie had been out for a few days with his new paramour, so when he managed to drag himself back into the house, he was met with a house full of mourners for his 2 middle daughters. And the townsfolk were simply aghast, right? That he hadn't even known that his daughters had been ill. Just where had he been? Well, I mean, you know how people can be. And this pleased Nanny because it made her look so good, and she got all of the sympathy. But as Charlie watched his wife, he began to really watch her face. And he saw that the sad smile she always wore was not sincere. And there was just nothing behind those eyes. And long story short, it dawned on him that the girls' own mother might have just murdered them. In that moment, he grabbed Melvina and he fled in the quiet of the night, thinking he was saving their lives. The money ran out fast, and Nanny was forced to get a job at a cotton factory of sorts. She had the baby to take care of, and her mother-in-law, who thought her son had actually abandoned them, and her ill health got really bad really fast. Some kind of stomach ailment that had bothered her only here or there, but everyone was guessing from the shame of her son's family abandonment. She was stricken with very painful gut and stomach pain until she died in the same year her son had left their family. I mean, it was no wonder she was sickly already anyway, right? Well, the next year, Charlie appeared back at the house with a new woman, a little boy, and her eldest daughter, Melvina. He had showed up to ask Nanny to leave, so she took the baby and Melvina with her back to her parents' farm, but Charlie was scared, guys. Official divorce not long after. Nanny went to work in a different cotton mill, and this one paid her better than she had ever made, and she still naturally drew male attention her way. She was still so young. But she went back to the Lonely Hearts ads in the newspapers. She sent letters again, only now they were a little more risque, as one would say, and then she would send them with a pie or some kind of baked good, which is an excellent strategy, at least back then. And that is how, in 1929, the now 24-year-old mother of now only 2 daughters met a man named Robert Franklin Harrelson. who worked in a factory. A lot of people did if they didn't work on farms, by the way. It's pretty common. He had a small apartment in the city and he loved jazz music. He was the coolest, you know. And then he was finally invited to the family home to meet Nanny in person. And of course he was immediately smitten. He sent flowers and wrote her poetry, all of the things her black little romantic heart wanted. He proposed after only a couple of months, secured an even better job making more money, and they soon married and moved to Georgia with the 2 girls. But when the honeymoon phase was over, Nanny realized her husband had a bit of a drinking problem. And life was good. They lived a mostly middle-class life, and she was home with her beautiful daughters, and she ensured her husband had a hot, home-cooked meal, except he stayed out more and more, drinking with his buddies. And that turned into him getting into drunken bar brawls, which would get him arrested, and Nanny would have to go down to pick him up from the jail. But with the ups and downs, this marriage did last 16 years. Her husband was a drunk, and she simply endured. Melvina and Florence, that's the baby, right? They grew into lovely teenage girls nearing adulthood, and both, just like their mother, were chomping at the bit to get married and get the hell out of their parents' house. Melvina met a nice young man that Nanny had approved of, and she married him in 1942. At this point, Nanny was 37 years old, and her oldest child was now married. Melvina gave birth to her first baby, a son she named Robert Lee Haynes, and Nanny was over the moon. She had experienced a pretty intense depression before the baby came, but once he was in the world, guys, Nanny helped with everything. And Florence also moved in with big sister Melvina to help with the baby. I mean, imagine getting that kind of help. So 2 years later, Melvina would give birth to another baby, an infant girl. Only this pregnancy had been a difficult one on Melvina. She was a small young woman, and her hips bothered her horribly this time around. The birth had been excruciating, and Melvina was convinced that she wasn't even going to make it. But she did. And this was the heat of the summer in 1945, and after hours and hours of intense labor, the baby was born, though Melvina was too weak to hold her. So the newborn was handed to Nanny, the logical next best thing, right? Well, official stories state that the doctors left the room for a moment, and when they got back, the infant was dead. The doctor said that due to the lengthy labor, the baby had most likely been starved of oxygen and had just simply not made it. Melvina was inconsolable. But Melvina had a small little snapshot of a memory while in her exhaustion after the baby was born. And in her weakened state, as Florence was sitting there with her, Melvina told her sister that it was like a dream kind of, but she remembered her mother had taken a hat pin out of her hair, one of those really long, sharp hat pins, and had pushed it through the soft spot of the top of the newborn's head. She told Florence that this simply must have been a dream, right? Because there's no way that her mother would murder her baby. Only Florence had remembered that when she came back into the room, she had found that the baby had died and distinctly remembered that her mother was sort of fidgeting with a hat pin in her hand. But, both girls couldn't fathom their mother murdering a baby because she was so completely devoted to her grandson, Robert. So they pushed the suspicion aside and they moved on for a time. But the death of the baby created a divide between Melvina and her husband, and they started drifting apart. Melvina sought companionship with other men. Now, Nanny found out. She raked her daughter over the coals about it, telling her not to make the same mistakes that she had made, begging her, please, show up for this baby, just stop. But it was of no use. Melvina was regularly leaving toddler Robert with Nanny to care for so she could go out and be a, quote, harlot. And Nanny was angry about Melvina's, lack of compliance, if you will. So one weekend when Nanny had Robert, she fed him his breakfast, she cleaned him up, and she sent him outside to play. And while he was playing, she started making the toddler some cookies. She, of course, put arsenic in the cookies, and then when they were done and cool, Nanny started feeding them to her grandson, one after another. He was in bed with these horrible abdominal pains before dinner, and by the time Nanny woke up the next morning, well, the boy had been deceased for hours. She then did what she knew would be expected of her to, quote, suddenly find her beloved 2-year-old grandson dead. And she went through all the emotions. Oh, my God. So the doctor came and determined the cause of death to be SIDS, which was called cot death back then. Mysterious death of toddlers and babies. Nanny had tried to get a hold of her daughter to give her the news, but she was off with her lover and had to find out when she got back. And of course, she was utterly devastated. The funeral had been a few days later, and Nanny was sure to put in a big, powerful show of her grief and even fell dramatically into the mud in a sort of fainting despair spell. But Melvina felt that a mother had done something to her son, as she was now convinced she had done to her infant daughter. Nanny's husband, who had just himself returned from a drunken bender, had taken Nanny home, then went to Melvina and Florence, who he did care about, as if they were his own daughters, and he announced, quote, "I reckon that I'm next." And he was right, because not long after, he had stayed out during one of his drunken stupors and had had to call Nanny to come pick him up from the bar. She did, and then according to the book I mentioned earlier, he forced himself on her that night. The next morning, he left for work while she put arsenic in one of his moonshine bottles that he had hidden out in the yard. She was so relieved after her decision to get rid of her husband, she took one of the most cleansing naps by the fire that she had ever had that afternoon. The next morning, she went outside and found her husband's body laid out in the yard, not too far from where he had unsuccessfully hid his moonshine bottle from her, and she called the police. He reeked of alcohol so very strongly that it was stronger than the smell of his body just beginning to decompose. And it was assumed he had cirrhosis of the liver, drank until he passed out in the elements outside, and died. Seemed pretty cut and dry. I mean, the entire town knew of his alcoholism, so it didn't really come as any big shock. Her daughters attended the funeral, but really had nothing to do with their mother after that day. Her husband had taken out a big insurance policy on himself, which he actually had done. She hadn't done it. She got a big chunk of change. I didn't see an exact dollar amount, but she took some of that money and bought 10 acres not far from where she had been raised, put a small house kind of tucked back in a corner, then rented the acreage out to farmers, and she made a cut of the profits. I mean, she had indeed set herself up to not really have to work anymore. She wasted no time, though. She started writing men again from the Lonely Hearts ads, only she stretched herself out greater distances and met several men, but specifically a man named Arlie. And this guy really stood out. He was generous and patient, completely content for her to take the lead in social situations. He took her dancing, a regular Prince Charming. They were married within a few months, which is her pattern, and she moved to North Carolina from Alabama, and the marriage was fantastic for a while. But eventually Arlie's love of wine, no different than the alcoholism of her other husband, just a different sort of socioeconomic status, began to show, as did his inability to be faithful. He loved Nanny, to be sure. He found her beautiful, all of the things, but he just couldn't, I guess, keep it in his pants, right? Nanny got her silent revenge by traveling off for weeks at a time to meet up with other single men as sort of Arlie's punishment. But she always came back home, and he always apologized, and that was that. But after a few short years, Nanny began to see that this marriage number 2, was not going to be the fantasy that she had always believed she deserved. So she lovingly cooked him a big fancy meal and had taken hours to bake this stewed prune pie that had such intense flavor. Though there was something just underneath, right? But he didn't want to say anything about an odd aftertaste, right? He didn't want to hurt her feelings. The next morning, she summoned the local doctor, who eventually came by and pronounced Arlie dead. Had to have been that awful flu that was going around at the time, right? She played the part of the grief-stricken wife, and all of Arlie's family and friends circled around her in comfort. But Arlie's sister had wanted her brother's house since everyone knew Nanny had her own house in Alabama. Wouldn't you know it, Arlie's house burned immediately after that. Everyone suspected, but no one came out and accused Nanny of doing it. Nanny moved in with her mother-in-law, Arlie's mother, who had been elderly and sickly, and, yeah, you guessed it again, she died within months of her son. Everyone had witnessed Nanny nurse that old woman, and all thought she was just a saint. She then took off back to Alabama. She immediately ran to the bedside of one of her sisters, who kind of sounded like she might have had cancer, to try to nurse her sister back to health. The sister had eagerly eaten the stewed prunes and had died a week later. She visited Lou, her mother, at the old farm now that Jim, her father, was dead, and it was clear that her mother was going to need help, so Nanny decided to move her mother in with her into her cottage on that land. And then she cooked for her mother, who she still held a bit of a grudge towards for all of the years of her enduring the wrath of her father, and her mother allowing it, of course, and her mother began to get ill. Oh, sicker and sicker she became, with Nanny lovingly at her side taking care of her. Lou finally passed away, and Nanny went back to what she enjoyed the most, looking at the singles ads. She went on to join a dating service called the Diamond Circle Club, where she met Richard Morton, and they married in 1952 and settled in Kansas. At this point, Nanny was 47 years old. This husband apparently wasn't a drunk, but he did play grab-ass with other women. He was dead 3 months later. Then in June of 1953, Nanny met and married Samuel Doss and lived with him in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel had been a minister and was highly disapproving of the romance novels and magazines that Nanny loved so much she was just obsessed with. 3 months later, he was admitted to the hospital, a very sick man. He was treated and released, and a week later, well, he was dead as well. She did her usual and began trying to collect on the life insurance, and his doctor actually noticed. She made him feel quite suspicious, and due to the suddenness of his death, the doctor ordered an autopsy. Now, sources all agreed that the doctor said there was enough arsenic in his system to kill a horse, is how it was worded everywhere. Nanny was promptly arrested, and under the duress of losing her magazines and her books, it was said that she confessed to murdering all of her other husbands, save the first. Bodies were then exhumed. They tested positive for arsenic. Her trial was swift, and she was found guilty of murder. She had originally found that her fate was to go on a date with the electric chair, right? But a judge deemed her insane, so he took the death penalty off the table because he didn't really want to put a woman in the electric chair, and she was just happy to have life in prison. What garnered her the nickname the Giggling Granny was her constant smiling and giggling when talking about the murders that she committed. She said that it was her childhood traumatic brain injury that made her capable of poisoning and murdering so many people. She died from leukemia in the hospital ward of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in 1965. She is buried at Oak Hill Memorial Park in McAlester, Oklahoma. So, she blamed her criminal behavior on her head injury. What do you think, guys? I think there was an awful lot of nurture there even before the head injury, which then exacerbated things. She was just less, it seemed to me anyway, that she was less able to control the impulses of pretending like he wasn't making her angry and she wasn't pissed and frustrated and so on and so forth. I think that the nurture was already there, and I think the head injury just sort of made everything all caps, all capitals, you know? I definitely think so. But, you know, she follows the very predictable female serial killer pattern in that she poisoned. Most of them do that. Most female serial killers don't want to get their hands dirty, and I say that in quotes, dirty, air quotes. So they poison because there's a degree of separation there. It's not a stabbing, it's not a shooting, it's not anything like that. Plus all of the brownie points because they're there trying to nurse their loved one back to health. I mean, you know, as far as a way to be a serial killer, as far as women go, that's the way to do it. But please don't do that. Please don't do that. But I don't know, guys. What do you think about this story? What do you think about Nanny? If you would like to, and I would like for you to, I would love for you to, leave me a comment under the video or the audio podcast, or DM me on Instagram at serial_killing. You can email me. You can come join the Facebook group, Serial Killing a Podcast fan page on Facebook. The link is down in the notes and everything. And come tell me what you think. I feel very strongly of a specific personality disorder. You tell me which one you think she's exhibiting. Which one is she exhibiting the most signs of, in your opinion? Let me know in the comments. And as always, guys, thank you so much for listening, because I know you could be listening to anyone else, but you keep listening to me, and I appreciate it so much, guys. Don't forget, Murder in the News is on its own channel now. It's just called Serial Killing Murder in the News. Not hard to find. It's available in all of the same places. Come give it a listen. And thanks so much, guys. We'll talk to you in the next one.
Anybody who killed more than 2 or 3 people was a mass murderer. And whether it was all at one place or over an extended period of time, and then in the early 80s they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.